their next playbook and the next card in their playbook, their next move, it will be false flag terror attacks blamed on Trump supporters angry about the verdict. We do not want any violence. We do not want any attacks. We are intellectually, culturally, spiritually winning.
Turning to some of the day's other news now, and it's been revealed US President Joe Biden secretly gave Ukraine the green light to start using US weapons to strike targets inside Russia. He's joined a dozen other nations in giving Kyiv the go-ahead to use weapons they provide to strike Russian troops, artillery and planes on Russian territory. But Biden says America's weapons can only be used on the Russian side of the border in the vicinity of the besieged city of Kharkiv. This is a major reversal of Biden's previous ban, and there are fears it could escalate tensions with the Kremlin. In other news, a member of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's own war cabinet has submitted a bill demanding early elections. And an infamous hacking group is demanding $500,000 ransom from event ticketing giant Ticketmaster in return for sensitive data belonging to 500 million of its users. This has been Matt Boyland with your TNT News Brief. I will be back with more at the top of the next hour.
Well, a very warm welcome to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. This is the show where we strip the day's big talking points down to their bare bones and devour the red meat of pure debate, as we focus on the stories that matter to you, wherever you're listening or watching from around the world. Today, well, what a news day it has been. What does Donald Trump's conviction mean for the United States and the world? Benjamin Netanyahu's potential downfall and the latest in Gaza. And Biden has allowed Ukraine to hit targets in Russia with US weapons. As always, I want to hear from you. I've got a fantastic panel of guests, but I want to hear your voices as well. You can call us, and this is how you can do it.
Our lines are open. From the U.S. and Canada, call 1-888-201-6425. From the U.K., call 033-0024-1026. And from Australia and New Zealand, call 1-800-670-310. Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Wonderful stuff. And as I say, it's really important that I have your voices. Do ring those numbers. And we've had so many fantastic callers to the show here at the Muckrakers. And if you've got any thoughts on the topics we're talking about, or even if you want to raise something completely different, do get in touch. Well, today it's made up not just of me, but I've also got Professor Saul Takahashi. And we may be joined, I say may, by Shane Healy. But let me first of all tell you about Saul Takahashi. He's a professor of human rights and peace studies at Osaka University in Japan. He's an international human rights and humanitarian lawyer, so 2 lawyers for the price of 1. And his main research interests include human rights in Palestine and Islamophobia. Saul serves as the deputy head of the Office of the UN High Commission for Human Rights in Occupied Palestine from March 2009 to May 2014. Now, we may, if the hamsters work well as well, have Shane Healy, who's all the way over in Australia. And he's worked in the Australian Army as an intelligence officer, a trainer, and as a private military contractor as well. He was deployed twice to Afghanistan, and in Australia was part of the Tactical Assault Group, where he was involved in several real-time terrorist incidents. He now works for both government and private firms in the area of threat assessment. Well, let's start off, first of all, with Donald Trump. It has dominated the headline, as only Donald can, about the conviction. He's been found guilty. If you haven't been sleeping under a rock, you'll know. Found guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records, and he was convicted of all 34 charges against him. They found that he paid hush money to adult film star Stormy Daniels and falsified business records to conceal the payment during the 2016 election campaign. Well, Saul, you don't mind me calling you Saul. We talked about that earlier. Where did you get the name Saul from? It's not a very typical Japanese name, is it?
Well, my father's American, so that's how I
There you
got the
go.
name.
There you go.
Yes.
I love it. The world now. We get all sorts of things. It's going to be
Oh,
good.
yeah.
Let's talk about your father being American. Then you'll have a very strong view on Trump. How do you think Trump's conviction is going to shape U.S. politics and affect the world?
Well, I don't know if I have a stronger view on Trump than most people do. Either you know, we were talking about this at work today, of course, and I think most people either, they're madly in love with him, and the fact that he's been convicted doesn't mean anything in terms of whether they're going to vote for him, or they loathe him and think he's the worst human being on earth, and they weren't going to vote for him anyway. I'm not sure how much it's going to make a difference. Look, I don't know. I mean, honestly, if you want my sense is that Biden has already lost. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure if this is really going to make a difference. It is quite amazing that you can be a convicted criminal and perhaps even serving. I kind of doubt he's going to go to prison. But look, I don't know. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? It's all very up in the air. What I find very but what's sort of at the core of my interests is what will, if Trump becomes president again, what is he going to do about Palestine? What is he going to do about the international system as a whole? It's very interesting, like with the International Criminal Court. As we all know, the International Criminal Court is probably going to issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu and the defense minister, and perhaps expand those arrest warrants to include other crimes and other Israeli military or political leaders. And frankly, they should. And the U.S. Has this piece of legislation which basically enables them, or sort of allows them to invade the Netherlands if an American is arrested by one of these basically by the ICC, or if they deem it, if one of their allies, if somebody from one of their allies is arrested by the International Criminal Court. So they can do this, and it'd be really interesting. I hate to use the word interesting, but I'm really sort of looking to see what's going to happen. I mean, if Netanyahu and or the defense minister, if those guys are arrested, they're taken to The Hague, and we see them in orange jumpsuits and in shackles and handcuffs, which I very much hope we will. What is Trump going to do? I mean, is he going to order the special forces into the Netherlands to take them back? And if he does, will they follow orders? I mean, this is something, which is really, it's hard to imagine here, but, I just don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. And it's
It is
a very
extraordinary.
unpredictable time.
It certainly is. And well, orange is the colour of the Netherlands anyway, so quite appropriate there.
Indeed.
Well, what I find extraordinary, Saul, as well, is that, as you say, even if he were arrested, and even if he were in prison and convicted and sentenced, and that's going to happen in a few weeks' time, he could still run and be president. Because all they have to do, according to the Constitution in the US, and you all know this, is the president must be 35 years old, he must be a natural-born US citizen, and he must have lived in the US for at least 14 years. That's all it is. It doesn't matter if there are criminal convictions or anything else. And interestingly, Trump would not be the first felon candidate, well, basically, to that sort of stuff. Socialist Party nominee Eugene V. Debs, you might remember, he ran for president in 1920 from a prison cell, whilst he was serving a 10-year federal sentence for imploring his supporters to resist World War I draft. And he got 3% of the vote. But Trump will be the first former president, obviously, to do that. So it is extraordinary. What I also like about the Debs analogy as well is that Debs was really brilliant at getting his supporters behind him, because what he did, he got them to wear a lapel badge saying convict number 9653, which Trump is like superb at doing. What do you think is going to happen to Trump's supporters as a result of all of this?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know. I mean, you see a lot in basically the corporate US media, sort of suggesting that people who are on the fence about Trump, if Trump is convicted, well, Trump's already been convicted, but if he goes through the appeal process and he's still sort of found guilty, and perhaps even if again, it's hard to imagine him serving jail time, but who knows? But, that could sort of force people, bring people who are on the fence about this election and who are sort of wavering to, abandon him and not to vote for him. But I don't know that there are too many people like that. I think, I can't honestly think, honestly speaking, I think this is kind of a mirage. This is kind of an illusion. I think, people have already decided whom they're going to vote for. And, that's it. So I just don't know. I mean, it's really hard to know what's going to happen. It's very unpredictable. But, there's always the chance in the United States, unfortunately, there's always the chance for, internal violence and sort of mass kind of unrest. There's always a chance of that. And with so many people, many of whom are crazy, running around with guns, it's a very frightening situation. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen. Trump is not a cause. He's a symptom. But of course, like all symptoms, when it gets bad enough, it also becomes a cause. So, it's hard to know what to say, but really, it's I don't know. It's frightening, but I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, it is frightening. And you remember back to the election and the insurrection. And obviously, this is just
Yes.
one of a number of cases. It's one of four major cases against him, some to do
Yeah.
with the January the 6th riots and so on and so forth. So that will come up in due course. But Trump is a master manipulator, isn't he? Because he told his supporters, the system's against me. They're going to come and get me. And the more things they threw at him, the more his popularity increased, didn't it?
Yes, yes, it's amazing. Look, I mean, one of the things I think about Trump and why he has such resilience amongst his supporters, his base. The thing about Trump is that I think a lot of Americans, even on a subconscious level, they somehow relate to him. I mean, the thing is, he is the embodiment of the typical American boss. He's a dictator. He does whatever he wants. If you don't like it, well, you're fired. Or, if you don't like it, you can find another job and become a dictator yourself. He's obnoxious. He's boorish. He's a buffoon. He's completely ignorant of anything. But this is a sort of typical American boss type. I'm not saying that all Americans are like this or all American bosses are like this, but it's the kind of typical American boss that I think a lot of Americans have seen, have experienced, and that they see on also popular culture. So I think on a subconscious level, somehow they relate to him. And I think that's one of the reasons that he sticks around and that he just, he continues getting those votes. It's frightening, but it speaks to the state of American society and the lack of, the violence that is at the core of American society.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We talked about appeal, and obviously, he's said he's probably going to appeal. He's got, as I
Yes.
understand it, 30 days in which to do it, and then I think a number of months after that to lodge the full appeal. The reality is this, isn't it? There's a couple of grounds. Let's have a look at those briefly, because obviously Stormy Daniels featured front and center of this
Yes.
particular trial. The witness testimony was very graphic, and it sort of detracted from the real thing. It wasn't about whether he had an illicit affair with her, whatever happened behind closed doors, the rights and wrongs of that. It wasn't about that at all. It was all about falsifying business records. Do you think that's a sufficient ground for allowing the appeal?
Well, look, I'm not a U.S. lawyer, and so I haven't gone through all the kind of documents. I mean, if the lawyers say that, it's that there's sufficient grounds for an appeal, maybe they're right and they have the right to do it. But, look, the whole thing, I mean, like you mentioned before, there are other charges which are going to be brought against him, presumably, that are far more serious, and they have to do with the insurrection that took place at the Capitol on the 6th of January, and also his pressure of the state officials in Georgia to try to change the election. Obviously he says that's not what I meant, and it can be taken either way. But these are far more serious charges, and frankly, I do believe that if the Democrats had been serious about this, they would have brought those charges far, far before. I mean, look, if I had done, if you or I had done something 1/10 as serious as he had done, then we would be looking at four concrete walls for a very, very long time, and it would not have taken them, 3 or 4 years to bring these charges. So I really do think, I mean, I don't believe that there's this big conspiracy, but I just don't think it's been serious. I think really they should have done this much, much earlier and done it in a much more serious way. I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, it is interesting, but let's look at the US sort of impact, if you like, on the world stage. Do you think this will potentially shift the US foreign policy or defense policy in any way?
Well, if Trump becomes president, I mean, it could change very dramatically. And it's very hard to know in what way. I mean, he's very unpredictable, and I think also intentionally so. He's criticized NATO. He's talked about, the US pulling out of NATO. Maybe that's a good thing. I mean, I don't really know. There's a lot wrong with the international system that we have now. I don't think Trump's, the kind of sort of behavior and non-policy policies that he sort of exhibited and tried to advance during his first term, I don't think those are the solution necessarily. But there are a lot of problems, and I think a lot of Americans and a lot of people all over the world are realizing or have been realizing for a long time that we have these problems, and just business as usual is not how things should be. And that's the problem with Biden and most of the Democrats. It's just business as usual. It's just perpetual war, pockets of the billionaires, and then and that's just how it is. Business as usual. USA, the greatest country in the world, and then end of story. So a lot of people are sick of that. They see through it, and I think that's one of the reasons that we see so much solidarity with Palestine now, and so many sort of demonstrations and general sort of dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I personally believe that if Trump gets in, he's more likely to gain respect from people like Putin and so on and so forth. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I mean, maybe. I don't know. It's a possibility, just because he's of his sort of general sort of tough guy and unpredictability. I certainly do not believe the whole narrative that the corporate media tried their best to promote, that somehow he was in the pocket of Putin, he was a puppet of Putin. I mean, I'm sorry, I just don't believe it, and frankly, I think most Americans are intelligent enough not to have believed that either. But yeah, I mean, look, the international community can be a pretty hard-nosed, hardcore place, and international diplomacy can really be sort of, fights without the gloves, if you like. So, there's a possibility. It's really hard to say. And, with Trump regarding Palestine, obviously his first term was quite disastrous in many ways for the Palestinian people. But the thing is, Trump is he has no principles. I mean, his only concern is he and his cronies making money. I mean, that is all he cares about, and nothing else matters to him. So, if he believes, if he comes around to believing that, dumping Israel is better for his pocket or the pockets of his cronies, he will do that in a second. So, I'm not saying that that's definitely going to happen, or I'm not saying that I have a way of bringing that about, but it's kind of unpredictable. Whereas Biden is, he's a believer, as far as I understand from all the people in DC. He is, he believes in the Zionist project. He believes in, he announces himself that he's a Zionist, and he believes in Israel. So, this is one of the reasons I think he's clinging on to this unwavering support of the Israelis, even in the face of all this criticism, domestic and international. So, I mean, the thing is, we're being fed this idea. We're being told. I'm not a U.S. citizen, just so you know, so I can't vote in these elections. But we sort of collectively are being told. Trump would be terrible. Trump would support Israeli genocide to the hilt, and Trump would, crack down on the protests in U.S. universities. So we all have to vote for Biden because whatever, because he supports Israel to the hilt and he's cracked down on the protesters. So I mean, really faced with this kind of choice, this kind of non-choice, I think people are really sick of it, and the whole, lesser of two evils argument is just simply not holding water anymore, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. You make a fascinating point. What I love about the Muckrakers with Andrew Eborn here on TNT is that we can get different views from around the world. We encourage lots of people to do that. You're in Osaka, in Japan at the moment. Tell me, what's the view in Japan of Trump? Do they think it's just one big joke, or do they think he's a credible politician?
Well, I don't think anybody thinks he's a credible politician. I mean, of course, they think he's a joke, and they're horrified. I think most people in Japan are horrified at the prospect of him becoming president again. And during the first term, this is interesting. When he was elected, like a lot of people, in fact, our political elite was just astounded. They were stunned. And I know that the prime minister basically called in the diplomats in D.C., the Japanese diplomats, and said, what's going on here? Why didn't I know this was going to happen? In all fairness to the diplomats, look, nobody really predicted this, but I think those diplomats were really given a dressing down because they hadn't gathered enough proper information. A lot of them were just sort of watching the corporate media and forwarding that information out back to Tokyo. So the prime minister Abe at the time was really pissed. Now so Trump becomes president, and instantly it becomes clear that the entire security policy of Japan is based on the Americans coming to our rescue should something happen. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, North Koreans attack us, or we get into trouble with the Chinese, whatever. The Americans are going to be here. They're going to come rescue us. To make sure that they're going to come rescue us, we have to continue on in a situation of fealty and lick their boots whenever we can. This is what it is. This is Japanese security policy. It's not a sort of Japan first security policy. It's an America first security policy in many ways. But during the first Trump term, it became very clear that these guys are just unreliable. And if something should happen, we just couldn't rely on them anymore. So you saw, there were very sort of quiet feelers, should I say, out to the Chinese, trying to sort of build those bridges or mend those bridges that we had burnt in recent years, and trying to sort of make sure that, we had a plan B in place. Not so much that we would enter into a military alliance with the Chinese, but just to make sure that, up till now, we've been sort of acting like the tough guy because we thought the Americans were backing us. Now, we're not so sure anymore. So, frankly, I'm not so sure that's a bad thing. So Trump is gone, and now Biden's back, and now it's basically back to business as usual. It has been back to business as usual, with Japan adopting a very sort of hardline stance against China together with the Americans. And this is not necessarily conducive to peace in this region either. So, I don't know. It's really difficult to predict what's going to happen. But certainly, should Trump get elected again, the political elite in Japan and I think most of Western Europe, they're going to be realizing that, look, we can't count on the Americans. We cannot rely on the Americans being a serious country, first and foremost, and being there when we're in trouble. We just can't count on this anymore. So you're going to see a lot of sort of traditional American allies, I think, distancing themselves.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating time, and we will unpack it here on the Muckrakers. We're going to have a quick break. When I come back, we're going to have Benjamin Netanyahu's potential downfall and the latest in Gaza. You're watching the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Ebon. We'll be back after these messages.
TNT's Jason Olbourne.
How did you discover the merits of Assange yourself and become so interested in his case?
I started going down that particular path of researching Julian and seeing what he stood for, and is it something that I can get on the same side of? And after doing all that, I realized right now Julian Assange is, in my book, is a hero. What he has done, he falls in that same category as Edward Snowden.
Weekends with Jason Olbourne on today's News Talk TNT.
In a democracy, the majority vote rules. But in most democracies, you can only vote for change every 3 or 4 years. To understand what people want, governments and political parties use focus groups. These focus groups can include as little as 20 people. Australia is a country of over 25 million people. Does making decisions based on 20 people sound fair to you? Have your say. Be heard in between elections. Download the 4MySay app now. That is number 4, MySay.
This is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk TNT.
This is indeed the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Ebon. Thank you so much for joining me. And I want you to be part of the conversation. This is how you can get in touch.
Thanks for listening to us. Now we want to listen to you. Our lines are open from the U.S. and Canada. Call 1-888-201-6425. From the UK, call 033-0024-1026. And from Australia and New Zealand, call 1-800-670-310. Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk TNT Radio.
Free speech is indeed alive and well. And somebody else who's alive and well is the wonderful Basil Valentine, because we've had a bit of problem tracking down Shane Healy. I'm sure we'll get him on another occasion. How are you, Basil? Thank you for joining us.
Very well, thank you, Lembit. Great to be with you. And hello to our viewers and listeners all around the world.
Wonderful. I'm not Lembert, I'm Andrew Evon, but sometimes while you pretend to be Shane, I can pretend to be Lembert. I don't mind. We can pretend to be anybody. Somebody can pretend to be Trump.
A little bit like him. A little bit like
I look a little bit like him with the cheeky girls and things like that. It's got to be good. I love it. We're joined by, I don't know if you met before, it's our first time, Professor Saul Takahashi, my very good friend now from Osaka. We were chatting earlier because I spent a lot of time in Japan. I did a lot of work with Dentsu and Fuji and the giants of Japanese business. And it's one of my favorite places.
For sure.
They are giants for sure. And it's a glorious time of the year as well. Just had the cherry blossom seasons, haven't you?
Yeah, well, a little bit, I guess about a month ago or so. Yes.
Yeah, a beautiful time. I'd recommend it to everybody.
It is a very nice time. Yes.
Very nice. Well, Basil, you've missed us. We've been covering Trump. We've sorted him out, so that's all good. Another one to unpack. Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, let's have a look at this sort of side then. I mean, how long? Let's start with you, Basil. How long do you see Benjamin Netanyahu lasting as Israel's prime minister?
Well, that's a very good question. Apparently, there are moves afoot led by Yoav Gallant himself to bring the government down. He is the ultimate political survivor. He's been prime minister of Israel for something like 18 of the last 25 years. It's extraordinary. He never seems to look any older either. But, you know, with a warrant out for his arrest, not that that seems to matter within Israel's borders at all. In fact, that could, if anything, make him more popular. Nevertheless, his fragile coalition is starting to get frayed at the edges. I think people feel that a different figurehead might give Israel a bit of a fresh start in the international community, because he is very much a tarnished brand. Democrats in the US, even normally loyal allies like Chuck Schumer, have started saying, well, perhaps if they get rid of Netanyahu, we can have something of a reset and all that. But Netanyahu himself isn't really the problem. Anybody who takes over from him is going to pursue exactly the same policy. There are no peaceniks in Israel anymore. You know, the days of Yitzhak Rabin are long since past, unfortunately. So, yeah, he may go. I personally think he belongs in a jail cell for the rest of his life. I think that's highly unlikely to happen. But no real prospect of much change should they depose him one way or another. And of course, he's also facing these corruption charges within Israel. I think he might be hoping that he's done such a fantastic job in the eyes of Israelis that somehow all that melts away.
Well, you say that. I mean, it always reminds me. I mean, there's so many questions to unpack here about how the Israeli security service is supposed to be the best in the world, how they didn't know about October the 7th, what information did they know and what did they do about it? And I'm always reminded of the movie Wag the Dog. What do you think of Netanyahu, Saul?
Well, I completely agree with Basil, what you said. I mean, first of all, yes, I dream of seeing him in an orange jumpsuit, like we were saying before you came on the program, and I think he deserves to spend the rest of his life in a jail cell. Him and pretty much all of those guys. Whether it'll happen, I mean, I don't know. I haven't lost hope. Obviously, I'm a former UN guy, so I try to sort of. I still have a little bit of a glimmer of hope. I cling on to that glimmer of hope that I have with the international system. But let's see. But definitely, I certainly agree with you that even if we get rid of him and this current bunch of fascist cronies, the quote unquote most right-wing government in the history of Israel, it's just the same. I mean, he is not the problem here. I mean, it is the whole sort of, the state of Israel is a settler colonial project, and it's basically based on genocide. It's based on the annihilation of the indigenous Palestinian population, and that's what they've been doing since 48, even earlier, arguably, but certainly since 48. And as far as 67 goes, the colonization of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and this has been going on since nonstop since 67. So if the international system were really as robust as it should be, then it wouldn't be just Netanyahu and those two people in the dock. It would be frankly all the Israeli political leaders from the beginning of time, and certainly since 67. So, that's not, he's not the only problem here. Even if he should be replaced, we'd still be, the next guy would surely pursue pretty much the same policy. And that's what's so dangerous about this whole narrative of Netanyahu being the problem. It's actually very similar to what we were talking about earlier, Trump being the problem. If as long as we get rid of Trump, everything is fine in the great PX, and the US is still the greatest country in the world, and freest country in the blah 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 blah. Same kind of thing. As long as we get rid of Netanyahu, then Israel is going to go back to being a liberal democracy and one of our valued allies, and they're going to be perfectly fine. When was this ever the case? This is another argument entirely, but that's the danger of this narrative that's really been propagated over and over again in the corporate media, I think, and that really, we really have to see through that and see through what's going on.
The problem we've got to jump in is that elements on Capitol Hill are absolutely in lockstep with the Israelis, even as the crimes get worse and worse by the day. Lindsey Graham went to Tel Aviv recently. And just yesterday, it was on the news at the top of the hour, and said, we dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima because they attacked us, so it's fine for Israel to do whatever they like. Absolutely abysmal. But that's the status quo in Washington, sadly. Not among the American people. This is the thing. It's really emblematic of the total disconnect between the vast majority of people all over the world, frankly, who simply abhor seeing children burned alive in tents, 35, possibly 40,000 people massacred, thousands more mutilated, hundreds of thousands traumatized. I mean, what on earth is going to happen to all the orphans with one leg? Nobody seems to think about that. Let's just drop some more bombs on them for the time being. So it's an absolute humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, which doesn't really even now get enough attention from the corporate media. Imagine for a moment that what's happened to Gaza and happened to Tel Aviv, my God, that you'd hear the howling from here to the moon, quite frankly, and nuclear weapons would almost certainly have been used to defend Israel. But somehow, because it's Palestinians, it's okay. When Israeli leaders say that they're dealing with human animals, there's no pushback from Brussels, London, Washington, or anywhere else. It's absolutely disgraceful. And people have started to see through it. The whole Gaza situation has, in a funny kind of way, ignited a kind of global wake-up call. People have realized that their leaders are fine with the mass murder and mutilation of children, and they're absolutely disgusted by it. But for the time being, political elites are still enthralled to the Israel lobby, and that's a big problem.
I couldn't agree more. It is absolutely abhorrent, isn't it? And I think, in very simple terms, then, is it genocide or a reasonable response to October the 7th? What do you think, Saul?
Well, of course, it's genocide. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, we can have sort of lawyerly debates about, the international definition of genocide and over and over and over. But again, I think like you were, like you were saying, I mean, had the tables been turned, what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza, if this had been, some kind of Palestinian attack on Tel Aviv, or if this had been, frankly, most other countries, if this had been Ukraine, then, the whole Western world would be up in arms in the UN and jumping up and down at the UN and taking their shoes off and smashing them on the table. So really, it is this, this stunning hypocrisy, these blatant double standards that are at play here. And, the notion that this is not a genocide, I mean, it's almost laughable, frankly. I mean, the mass amounts of massacres, killing, the clear targeting of civilians. And on top of that, of course, as we all have become sort of experts in this, over the past 7-8 months, it is the intent of committing genocide. With this is, as a lawyer, this is, in the international definition of genocide, it's not enough to kill thousands and thousands of people, even intentionally. You also have to have the intention of, annihilating a group in whole or in part, basically. But, the Israeli leader, and usually what happens in these kind of cases is that the leaders know that they might be held responsible. They know that, they might be put in the dock at some point. So they're very careful about what they say. And they, usually they try their best to sort of frame things so that they're, making a legal proportional response and that kind of thing. But, with the Israeli leaders, they've made, our job really easy for us. I mean, they come out and call all Palestinians human animals. They say that there are no, innocent civilians in Gaza. You have Netanyahu coming out and quoting from the Bible some kind of story of, complete annihilation
Really
of the enemy.
bizarro stuff. Bizarre
Yeah,
stuff, Saul. Do you know what I mean? Off the charts, really,
Yes, very much so. So, I mean, it's clear. I mean, like one of my former colleagues said when he resigned from the UN Human Rights Agency New York office and discussed, this is a textbook case. It's a textbook case of genocide. You can't get more textbook than this. It is very, very obvious. So, it's, real kudos to the South Africans for having brought that case in the International Court of Justice. And it's very important to see how that plays out. And it's, again, it's abhorrent and disgusting to see that the ICJ has ordered the Israelis to stop from these kind of genocidal attacks, and yet the Americans, are like, oh yeah, what does that mean? What do we care? The Brits are also basically the same. So
Yes.
so far that's where we stand. But the International Criminal Court going forward with these arrest warrants again, it's another sort of chip in the wall, if you like. It's another big smashing of the wall of Israeli impunity, and this wall is going to come down. I'm a human rights lawyer, so of course I mean, I worked for the UN for a long time, so I still, again, sort of cling on to some sort of final strand of belief in the whole system. But one thing I do know, I don't know this for a fact, but, one thing I do believe is that these, dictators and bad guys, this is what they are afraid of. And it's been reported that Netanyahu, in ordering the Mossad and all these kind of people to go threaten the prosecutors in the ICC, he was obsessed with this whole thing. And well, he should be. These bad guys, they wake up in the middle of the night, screaming and sweating, having these nightmares of being put on trial because they know they are doing bad things. They know that they are committing awful, heinous crimes. They just think that they can get away with it. Well, I really do hope that that's not the case. I hope that they won't. And I really do, I think he deserves to spend the rest of his life in a jail cell, like you said.
Yeah, it's interesting. Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz's centrist party has proposed holding a parliamentary vote on dissolving the Knesset. What should we expect, Basil?
A very good question. The extreme right, the Ben Gvir, Smotrich faction, they're angry with Netanyahu for not going in hard enough, believe it or not. So I think, I think he'll survive for the time being, believe it or not. But what I don't think he and the rest of the Israeli cabinet believe have really woken up to yet is the opprobrium, the disgust in which they're held by the rest of the world. They've still got the likes of von der Leyen, who incidentally, I saw today there are moves to prosecute Ursula von der Leyen for complicity in genocide, the European Commission president. I was very pleased to see that. I don't think they realize that the trouble they're in with global populations. Now, in the US, of course, they've tried to pass all sorts of anti-BDS legislation. We've had it here in Britain as well, very undemocratic. I mean, if we go back to that ICJ definition of anti-Semitism, it talks about singling out Israel for criticism. Well, I mean, if you can't single out a country for criticism when it's committing genocide, then when can you single it out? So I think a lot of the old fulcrum of conversation around Israel is now totally redundant. People are fully entitled not to want to have anything to do with anybody who supports Israel ever again. And I think that goes for about 80% of the global population. Just to bring us up to date, not only were Mossad threatening the ICC judges themselves, but also an investigative reporter with Israel's leading left-wing newspaper, Haaretz, has said unnamed senior security officials threatened him for reporting the intimidation of the former prosecutor of the ICC. Now, we're in a global constitutional crisis. And quite frankly, with American support, unfortunately, because they're not far behind, Israel are acting like gangsters. And, what happens over the next 6 months is going to be absolutely crucial as to whether or not we have any genuinely international law that is applied universally across the world or not. It's a crisis of the global order that we haven't seen in our lifetimes.
No, you're absolutely right. History will look back on this moment and see what we did or what we didn't do. I mean, the other thing is how the media is reporting it or not reporting it. I mean, what is happening on the ground at the moment in Gaza, which we should know about, which is not being covered by mainstream media? What do you think, Saul?
Well, I mean, look, the massacre after massacre, the targeting of civilians, the bombing of hospitals without any kind of justification, bombing of schools, destroying mosques, destroying every university that was in Gaza. I mean, the list goes on and on, of course, and this kind of thing is really, not reported on, at least not sufficiently in most of the corporate media. And when they do report it, and this is what really gets me, it's like some kind of, natural disaster that took place.
That's
We
right.
often say, like, when we're in the sort of pro-Palestinian or human rights sort of community, we talk about the subject of the sentence just magically disappearing. And we see this over and over with a lot of the corporate media, a lot of you've probably seen this in social media about BBC, but it's not just BBC. Israelis are killed. It's always Palestinians kill Israelis, but Palestinians, they die. It's like by magic, somehow, a bomb drops and somehow they just die. It's really insulting and an insult to the intelligence how the corporate media has been covering this whole thing since the 7th of October. I mean, all the stuff, the whole narrative about, these horrific attacks and by Hamas. I'm not saying, I'm not defending the attacks themselves, because clearly there were some violations, there were some war crimes themselves. But, it's a complete sort of humanization only of Israeli victims and dehumanization of the Palestinian victims. We also saw that, with the ridiculous narratives that had been coming out very, very quickly. The beheaded babies one was so ridiculous, even the IDF had to, deny it really immediately. So that didn't go so far, though somehow Biden didn't get the memo that it wasn't true. And he raised it in some kind of, I think it was a press conference somewhere. But also the sort of mass rapes narrative, the sort of systemic, Hamas ordered mass rapes. Look, as it stands now, and I'm not saying that things are not going to come out later. We don't know. Of course, this is a situation of armed conflict, and when women are subjected to sexual violence, of course, sometimes it takes time, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't know. But as things stand now, there is zero evidence for this, and you have very dodgy characters in Israel who were sort of amongst the first responders that came out with all these stories. Then those stories, spread a lot of, and basically they're being quoted and requoted by NGOs, and frankly by some reputable NGOs that I was very disappointed in. And finally, we have the UN Special Representative on, I think it's Special Representative on the Protection of Women in Armed Conflict. I'm probably getting the official name wrong, but it's something like that. Just to be clear, she is an independent expert. She is not a UN civil servant. And she operates from New York, so she would not have been assisted by, like my former colleagues in the Human Rights Agency in Geneva. But so she goes on this visit to Israel. She is invited by the Israelis. She's taken around by the Israelis. She meets people, only the people that the Israelis want her to meet. And, she comes out with this report. It is a careful report, but still, I mean, there just is no evidence for it. It's all, there's no victim testimony anywhere. We've spoken with people who've spoken with people who've spoken with the victims, and just you wait, it's going to come out now. It's going to be a big deal. This is going to be all over the place. But we don't have any testimony yet. But just you wait. And this has been going on for months and months. And of course, with the UN Special Representative, she does make it clear that she was taken around by the government. She's only met people that the Israelis wanted her to meet, et cetera, et cetera. But look, when I was working in Amnesty International, I mean, you would not have been able to publish something like that. You'd just be laughed out of the office. It's like, what are you, crazy? You think we're going to publish this? I mean, come on. This is, we're supposed to be an independent organization. So in the midst of an armed conflict, you got one side to take you around and meet the people they wanted you to meet, and you're saying we're going to publish? No, we're not going to. Forget it. They would have been binned, and nobody would ever take her seriously again. And that this, again, she's an independent expert, so she has a lot of leeway in what she publishes. The UN cannot really stop her. But of course, the headlines were UN says mass rapes occurred. Hamas orchestrated mass rapes. No evidence, nothing. But this goes on and has legs of its own. Being really propagated over and over and over. And this is it's all part of the sort of typical sort of Islamophobic trope of, Arab men who are, constantly coming to rape our women, that kind of thing. So, really the Israelis play on this as much as they can. And it's really problematic how this kind of thing has been propagated over and over and over, repeated over and over in the
and
local
it's so
media.
important. I always emphasize the point that obviously the first casualty in war is the truth, which is why it's so essential to question everything. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about Biden allowing the Ukraine to hit targets in Russia with US weapons. You're watching the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. We'll be back straight after these messages.
The challenges our planet's animals are facing sometimes feel a bit heavy.
The animals haven't eaten in a day, 2 days, they haven't drank anything, they're cold, they're dehydrated.
As soon as we started our descent, everywhere I could see was mud, just absolutely mud.
The country has been in prolonged drought for so long, it was like a tinderbox waiting to go up.
Okay, very heavy. Each of us wants to be part of the solution, and we can be. Remember that there's good happening right now. At home.
All right, we were able to get into your unit, and we have all 4 of your cats. So,
okay.
And around the world. For any animal in any disaster. So let's focus on that, right? Be part of the solution, one rescue at a time. Search ifa.org/disaster ready.
Many pollution sources can affect the air you breathe. From power plants and vehicles to dust and wildfires. Knowing more about local air quality can help you protect your health. If you're thinking about buying an air sensor, EPA has a series of videos to help you get the most out of it. Learn how EPA collects and uses regulatory data, how EPA communicates health messaging, and how to interpret the readings from your sensor. Visit epa.gov/air-sensor-toolbox.
Tracking global corruption and threats that undermine our security. This is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Yes, well, welcome back. It's Andrew Eborn here with the Muckrakers. I'm joined by Professor Saul Takahashi, who is in Osaka, I believe, in Japan, all the way over there. And Basil, who today is pretending to be Shane Healy from Australia. But I think you're up the road from me in Twickenham or something, aren't you, Basil?
No, I'm down on the south coast in Brighton, actually, Andrew.
Oh, we love Brighton. There you go. All good stuff.
Indeed.
Well, we also want to hear from you, and this is how you can do it.
Our lines are open. From the U.S. and Canada, call 1-888-201-6425. From the U.K., call 033-0024-1026. And from Australia and New Zealand, call 1-800-670-310. Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Free speech is indeed alive and well. And people always say they never have an opportunity to air their views. Well, this is the platform where you can do it. Poor old Basil's got a bit of a cough down there in Brighton. We'll forgive him for that. Pass a fisherman's friend. He can suck on that. So Biden's new policy of allowing Ukraine to target Russia internally. We're risking World War III, aren't we, Saul?
Well, I certainly think we are. All of these sort of restraints which the Americans had on the Ukrainians fighting back were, there was sort of red line after red line after red line, and of course it's almost like the red lines with the Israelis, frankly. And then all of a sudden the red lines dissolve, and obviously it's a little bit of a different situation, but it certainly seems like a dangerous move. I don't know what to say, but I really do think with Ukraine, we're looking at a situation of perpetual war, and this is not what we want to see.
You're absolutely right. Well, what are your views, Basil?
Well, it's not just the United States. It's been announced this morning that the German government has also said it will give Ukraine permission to use weapons supplied by Germany against military targets in Russia, according to Stefan Hebestreit speaking in Berlin this morning. I mean, that was the thing that German foreign policy for the last 70, 80 years was built to avoid. So many casualties on the Eastern Front between Germany and Russia from 41 to 45 that a German foreign policy was based around reaching out to the East, making sure that those horrors were never repeated. And now, for the first time since 1944 or whatever, the German collapse, German-made weapons are going to be striking targets inside Russia. It's not just stupid, it's reckless beyond words. It's completely and utterly idiotic, not least because for some reason European and US leaders are still clinging to the myth of the possibility of Ukrainian victory. There is no possibility of Ukrainian victory, none whatsoever. It's merely a question of how long the stalemate drags on, or whether the Russians can achieve a quick victory, or whether perhaps, and you get the odd lone voice like former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder talking about his personal relationship with Vladimir Putin as possibly being a path to peace. Otherwise, as Saul said, this is getting very, very dangerous and stupid indeed. Idiotic voices writing in supposedly serious publications talking about winnable nuclear wars. I know personally one of the chief war hawks in Britain. I went to school with him, and hey, Mr. Bretton Gordon, he's saying that we need to prepare for war with Russia. No, we don't. We don't want war with Russia. Hamish, you're very thick. You seem to have forgotten you were bottom of the class. Please shut up.
There you go. Good advice to Hamish. I'm sure if we get Hamish on the phone, we'll be able to hear his view as well. But let me ask you this, Saul. I mean, how much more US or European provocation can occur before Russia begins hitting equivalent targets in NATO countries outside Ukraine?
Well, I mean, the thing is, Putin is not stupid. And despite the portrayal of him in Western capitals and in most of the corporate Western media, he's not crazy. He's not insane. That's why I don't really buy this idea that he's going to be attacking NATO countries, because that would really start that we're really talking a full-blown war throughout Europe. I just don't see it happening. But of course, like you say, how much more provocation can he take? At a certain point, he is going to have to hit back. And, in what form that takes, I don't even want to think about it. I do think, he will try to avoid hitting NATO countries. Maybe he will hit Ukraine even further. I mean, I don't know. It's very difficult to know what's going on in his head. But what I can say is that he is not crazy. The North Koreans are not crazy. The Chinese leader is not crazy. These people are not crazy. And by demonizing them and painting them as crazy nutcases who only understand violence, basically what's going on is we are, encouraging perpetual war. We are just creating a situation where the public is supposed to go along with the leaders and say, yeah, well, so there's no point in talking with these guys. There's no point in negotiating. We just hit them where it hurts. We just shoot, bomb, and, bomb the hell out of them, and then everything's going to be okay. But it's not going to be like that. These people have different interests, and they might express their interest, they might pursue their interests in a way that are not necessarily conducive to, US and Western hegemony, but, they are rational actors, and we have to negotiate with them somehow.
So what do you think? Let me pick you up on that then, because I think it is so important that we shine a spotlight on this. And I always say that disinfectant, basically sunlight, is the best disinfectant. And I think it's right. We have to give a different narrative, which is what we do here on TNT. But what do you think then is the solution to the Ukrainian-Russian war?
Well, I don't know what the solution is to the Ukrainian-Russian war, honestly. I mean, certainly it's very, very clear that from the time that the Berlin Wall came down, for the Russians, Ukraine was the red line. That was the line across which, NATO must never go. And, that was always made very, very clear as far as I understand. And so, there's also the issue about the elections and the coup, all these kind of dodgy things which the West was involved in. So, from the Russian perspective, it's very, very understandable that they felt threatened. And they felt, that this was the time to just make a statement, if you like. I'm not defending their invasion of another country. I don't think, certainly as a believer in international law, that was not good. But again, we have to look at the context and realize that, there's a whole context to all of this. Now, so there has to be some kind of negotiated solution. It's just like, like Basil said, I mean, the notion that the Ukrainians are going to emerge victorious from this seems a little bit unrealistic to me, to say the least.
Which is interesting. Did you have a solution, Basil? How do you see it all ending?
Well, a very simple solution. In 1918, so many people had been killed, so many young men, a generation wiped out. Everybody decided they'd had enough, and they simply had an armistice. You simply put down the weapons and go to the negotiating table. It's not actually that difficult, but unfortunately, certainly in the West, we've deteriorated the conversation and the language used. That diplomacy is automatically equated with appeasement, that peace is somehow indicative of weakness. It's absolutely abysmal. We've spent 70, 80 years building up international institutions so that we had diplomats wise enough, old enough, experienced enough to defuse situations like this, so that the territorial disputes, because that's ultimately what it is, are settled around a conference table and not with bullets and bombs. But the point is, unfortunately, there are dark actors at work who want to either replace Putin in Russia so that they can control it and its natural resources. Frankly, like in many ways the Iraq War, I'm sure Saul would agree, the real reasons for why we destabilized Ukraine and installed this idiot puppet Zelensky, the real reasons why the war is still going on. Some people say it's just to fuel the military-industrial complex. I think there's more to it than that. And the reasons become occulted. They're hidden from us. And that's why it's such a difficult knot to unpick.
Yeah, you're absolutely. It's always going to be jaw, not war, war. So final point then, Saul, because time has fortunately, or unfortunately rather, run out on us. Final point, who do you think can bring about this discussion, bringing people around the table? Is it going to be Trump or Biden?
You're talking about Ukraine or Palestine, all of the above?
All of it. Who's going to be better at doing it, Trump or Biden?
Oh, dear. Look, I don't know. I mean, if Biden really wanted to try, he could stop the massacres in Gaza, in 10 minutes. I mean, he could do it with one phone call. The fact is he's not doing it. With Trump, I mean, who's to say? I mean, I think one of the things is if Trump becomes president again, and if he goes back to how he was in the first term and sort of, looks like he's unreliable and abandoning his traditional allies, the U.S.'s traditional allies, then, countries are going to sort of move away from the U.S. and from the U.S.-centered security Pax Americana, if you like. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe, certainly in Ukraine, maybe, we can see the Western European countries come together by themselves.
Let's hope that that's the case. Time has been against us. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time here on the Muckrakers. Take care.
To hear a replay of this hour, go to episodes at tntradio.live. Now, TNT Radio News.
With your hourly news brief, I'm Matt Boyland. Former US President Donald Trump will find out in July whether or not he's going to jail and for how long after he was convicted in his hush money trial in New York. History was made on Thursday as the ex-commander-in-chief was found guilty of falsifying business records during the 2016 presidential election to cover up hush money payments made to a porn star. Following a weeks-long trial and nearly 10 hours of deliberations, a 12-member jury convicted America's 45th president on all counts. The word guilty read out 34 times, one after the other, as each of the charges were read aloud. Each count is punishable by anything from a fine and probation to 4 years in prison.